Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, South Africa's #1 business news website. Now, the issue of executive pay was really thrust into the spotlight recently with the over 300 million rand remuneration of Sibanye CEO Neil Froneman. And I'm reminded of what political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville observed around democracy and socialism. They've got nothing in common but one word: equality. But notice the difference here. While democracy seeks equality and liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. Now, it's been a big talking point here when we talk about executive remuneration. Locally, Trade, Industry and Competition Minister Ibrahim Patel has put a new bill forward containing amendments to the Companies Act, and that's really what he termed to address the gross injustice of excessive pay. So it's clearly one of those issues that's receiving attention at the highest levels, and it's so far been, I must say, the bill's been met with a bit of incredulity from business. I am joined now to talk about the remuneration debate by Chris Blair, who's CEO at 21st Century Remuneration Specialists. So Chris, great pleasure to have you on the show. What motivated you to get into the remuneration consultancy business?
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael, and good afternoon to all the listeners. 21st Century has been around for 24 years. So we actually started it shortly, a few years after 1994. And obviously there was legacy of inequality right from the get-go, which came through from that. When we looked at it, it was a fledgling industry, and basically because South Africa was fairly cut off during those years, it wasn't necessarily following international norms. So there was a lot of catch up to do, and trying to address that inequality in terms of company wages. So it was really an opportunity that was right there for the taking. And the industry since then has grown significantly. There's a entity called SARA that puts through interns every year, and gradually businesses have grown their own remuneration departments, if I can call them that, if the company is big enough, to really try to institute good practice and good governance around remuneration in totality. But obviously the spotlight comes in at the executives, because those are the ones, first of all, it gets published in the remuneration reports. You can look it up, so they can't hide anywhere. But secondly, the executives do earn large sums of money relative to the lower level employees.
And SARA being, what was that, the South African Remuneration Association?
South African Reward Association.
Reward Association, right.
Reward, yeah.
Now, why is it important for businesses to use consultancy services when they think about structuring their executive pay? Why don't they just look around in the market, pull down a few annual reports and say, right, let's benchmark the level here?
Yes, Michael, good question. So I think there are a number of reasons that organizations use remuneration consultants. The first one that I think is important is that the remuneration consultants, if it's a good practice, they should be objective and impartial. So the executives can't really decide on their own pay, if you could call it that. So if they do download it, they say to the HR department, please download these 27 annual reports and tell us what to pay. There's no objective process in that. And also there's a lot of intellectual capital behind which comparators do you use, which 27 reports should you download. Why should you download them? So what they could end up doing if they do it in-house is to cherry pick and say, okay, we're going to choose all the CEOs that get paid loads of money because that's the comparator group. Or worse still, choose an industry that pays much more than the industry I'm in. So effectively, you're looking for an impartial advice coming from a professional organization that purports to give best practice that is objective, and then can go to the remuneration committee, get signed off there, and then get ratified at board level.
And the issue of remuneration is so critical to a company's functioning. For shareholders to get the right incentives in place, be they short-term or long-term incentives, and to ensure that there's alignment here between the executive and the board and what they're trying to achieve and what the shareholders would like to achieve. And it really it can take MBA thesis amounts of deliberation when it comes to how you structure this. So it is a lot more complex than just saying, right, we're going to benchmark it at a particular level. But I imagine there are many businesses who maybe incorrectly think their executive pay structure is already optimal because they haven't been actively challenged on the topic. How do you go about educating these businesses on the reality of their situation? Because what I'm seeing from where I sit, and I interview a lot of shareholder activists at the moment, this is becoming one of the big issues. If you haven't been challenged yet, that's not to say you won't be challenged in the future.
Correct, Michael. And I think on the challenge side, if the company is listed, then they have to produce a remuneration report in their annual financial statements, and that kind of opens it up where if they can't defend the position, and as King says, it used to be comply or explain, but now it's really opened up to anyone can go and get that report and have a look at it. But what's more probably pertinent is you're talking about where institutions don't have to report it. Now, how would they know that they're not that their practices aren't good? And like everyone, we always think our own stuff is pretty good. So what we do is we engage in dialogue with them, and generally it starts off with kind of a little bit of education, because remuneration is a very, very technical area which they may not realize. And then we often start off with an audit, and that audit is really around looking for inequity in pay practices, and whether it's just structured incorrectly. And then out of that report, if the organization is willing to go that route, which they should, because it's in their interests in the long term, because if you don't have your pay practices right, it affects your retention, your attraction, the efficiency of the organization. It affects everything, because the payroll is usually the biggest cost in the organization, and it is what makes you competitive. So most organizations are fairly open to it, unless they kind of below a certain size, then they kind of see it as we'll go it alone. And when we do those audits, I will say without fear or favor that in all the years I've been in practice, I've never had a client who their pay practices were perfect. Some are better than others, but there's always something that can be improved. And quite often they're a little bit surprised when the report comes back to say, these are areas of concern. These are areas you should have a look at.
So what are those biggest mistakes that you've come across, those big areas of improvement, that the mistakes that you see businesses making when it comes to structuring their executive remuneration packages that they could improve on?
So I think the biggest one that certainly the shareholders get very aggrieved about is where we say at executive level, the pay for performance link is broken. So in other words, the company is paying out handsome bonuses or long-term incentives, yet not delivering the value to the shareholder relative to their peers in the group, or relative to some sort of shareholder measure that the shareholders say, this is what I'd like to get back. And so that pay performance link has been a tough topic for years and years and years. It hasn't been resolved yet, by the way, because the last I in fact did my MBA, and I did one of those theses, and I did it on pay for performance. And at that stage, it was more than 5 years ago, but at that stage in the South African market, less than 50% of companies had a good pay performance link. So it was kind of 50-50 at that stage. I think there has been improvement since then. The other areas that are quite common is when companies have their jobs in the company, they have to size the jobs. Now, they use different methodologies to size the jobs, and depending on the the integrity of the job content that's used, the sizing of the jobs may not be correct. And if the sizing is wrong, then the benchmark is wrong, and therefore they're paying at the wrong level. And perhaps the last area that is tough for them, it's tough for all organizations, is addressing the wage gap. So that wage gap is right up there on the agenda. Certainly for South Africa. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world if you take the unemployed people into account. If you leave them out, it's a bit better, but it's still very unequal. And you have to manage that pay gap. You can't just let it run, and you can't use the rhetoric that goes out quite often. Oh, but we have to compete for talent. Yes, I mean that is true, but that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse for managing your wage gap.
Yeah. So what are you doing to potentially upskill your workers? Because we also know there's a big disconnect in terms of skills in the country. I want to come back though to that link between remuneration and performance, because it's been a big bugbear of mine. You often see remuneration packages that are structured around earnings, HEPS or whatever, and not economic value add. And as an executive, you can quite easily manipulate earnings. In a listed environment, you can gear up the balance sheet to deliver earnings that aren't sustainable. And then you see the thing collapse in a heap 7 years down the line. By that stage, the executive is ridden off into the sunset with their saddlebags bulging, and the shareholders are left with a very unsustainable company that's not going to deliver economic value add into the future. I much prefer an EVA type, Stern-based measure. What is your sense on how companies are graduating to something that better aligns shareholders with executives around long-term sustainable growth?
So that is a real hot topic at the moment, and really where there's a couple of things that make that relationship difficult, and that is that quite often executive contracts are 3 to 5 years, yet the long-term measure is longer than 5 years. So that's what the problem is. So now you have to remunerate your executive on a long-term sustainable value creation mechanism, but he's not there long enough to actually see it through. So that's the first problem, is the timing of what is long-term value creation. The second thing is, what is value creation? So you're talking about EVA, where the difficulty with EVA is it's quite a difficult accounting or financial concept for most people to grasp. And the move has been to simplify executive long-term incentives, particularly, and short-term, so that they know what they're going for. But at the end of the day now, the world has moved on, and COVID actually really propelled this, where the world is saying, when I say the world, it's moving from a shareholderism business model to a stakeholderism business model, where you're not just pleasing your shareholders. So now society weighs in, employees weigh in, even suppliers weigh in, financiers weigh in, and say, guys, this thing of what you're doing is not sustainable. So we want to see sustainable measures in the LTI, and that's introduced this whole non-financial, what they call non-financial measures, which are put into the ESG, environment, societal, and governance space. Now, the theory there is that if you have enough of those in, the business will be sustainable, and not only sustainable for the shareholders, but for all of the stakeholders that are involved. But we're at the beginning of that journey. We're actually not we're not as far down that journey as people think we are. So still 70% or more of the measures are typical financial measures that appeal to shareholder returns, some sort of shareholder return. And yes, we do need the shareholders there. But we also want sustainable business, and we also don't want business that is jeopardizing the planet, because of global warming, because of whatever. So so this is really a tough nut to crack. Really, but at least we're going there.
I even think, and we've seen this move from shareholder to stakeholder, but I still think, even if you look at the shareholder register of a large listed entity on the JSE, it would be pension funds. Many pension funds are actually benefits accruing to the broader stakeholder community, be it workers, be it communities that sit outside a mine, for example, or outside of a listed property building. And so I was chatting to Redefine's executive team about this at their Capital Markets Day. They're thinking long and hard about how they start to link the way they integrate their communities with the buildings around their, around their assets, and then to link this through KPIs through to performance from an ESG perspective. So it is starting to percolate, but I still think, to your point, it sits there amongst a very few, and it's starting to now become even more important and integral to thinking. So how do you then, when you sit down and you're trying to explain this to an executive team, how would you go about working with a business to improve their executive pay structures? Where would you start?
Yeah, and so obviously the business needs to be open to reviewing their remuneration structures. So we normally start off with their remuneration strategy, and we obviously look at the remuneration strategy relative to, we used to say, the company strategy, but let's actually go one step further, and it's company purpose. So organizations have started this journey of what is our purpose? Why are we even here? And the purpose used to be, we're here to generate profits and to pay our shareholders. And now that it's moved completely on from that, the Business Roundtable in America, I think they had 100 CEOs of the top companies signing the thing to say, we will find a purpose that is greater or wider, certainly, than shareholder returns. And once companies do that, then their remuneration strategy is cascaded down from that. And does the remuneration strategy drive that business purpose? And that's really where we start. And obviously executives are right up there with strategy, so they understand that fully. And then we start to really drill down to the mechanisms of remuneration and say, do each of them support the remuneration strategy, which supports the business purpose or company strategy? And it's very quick to start seeing, but there's a mismatch here. It doesn't actually match. And how do we actually address that? And then it comes round to rewriting that remuneration strategy, where the policy is, we will incorporate stakeholders into our remuneration strategy. It's not just about paying all of the employees. How do we look after the community that we operate in? We have to align our short-term incentives and long-term incentives to meet that purpose, to support that company strategy. You've got a better chance of your remuneration structure working efficiently. And generally, certainly the directors of the company understand that very well. When you get further down in the organization, it starts to become a bit more fuzzy, and less easy to link it so directly. But certainly at exec level, it's possible.
Yeah, well, absolutely, because you're often talking about, there's a fixed component, there's a variable component of pay that you can link through to many of these targets that are a lot more measurable from that perspective. In terms of trends, would you say that's the big one? Are there any other big trends or considerations that businesses should have when it comes to the structuring of their executive pay? Or is it just now all about how we think about this stakeholder model of capitalism that's developing?
Yeah, I think that's the big one for the moment, and very much that climate change is on the agenda, societal need is on the agenda, so they can't get away from that. I mean, there's a thing that you'll know about, Michael, called say on pay, where anyone with one share can bowl up and vote on the remuneration report. Now, there's a lot of talk out there to have a vote called say on climate. And I mean, that's the next step, because the millennials of the world are looking at the older generations saying, you're leaving a planet with me that is a mess, and I'm going to have to deal with this, and my children's children are going to have to deal with this. So I think there's just so much more pressure around these sustainable measures. But that's the nut to crack. What is sustainable? So you need financial stability, you need investors, but you also need to have a sustainable business that actually adds value to humanity and doesn't just use up resources and burn the world down
have this extractive mindset. Exactly. And we're seeing it in Europe at the moment, these record droughts, the Rhine River drying up, what's going on in China, as well as the recent floods here. All of this, I think, just bringing this idea home. And BlackRock, one of the largest asset managers in the world, is chaired by Larry Fink. And he's been writing to the CEOs of the companies they invest in to say, you have to start thinking about this, because ultimately capital is starting to flow where we're seeing that kind of responsible and ethical leadership at the end of the day. Chris, how do businesses get hold of you if they want to learn out more about how to start integrating this into their thinking?
Yeah, so the easiest is just to email us at info@21century.co.za. The landline is 011-447-0306, and they're welcome to contact me on my email address, cblair@21century.co.za.
Fantastic. In the business for 24 years, almost as old or as young, I don't know, as our young democracy. Chris Blair, CEO, 21st Century, talking executive pay here on Business Talk. A great pleasure, Chris. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks a lot, and thanks to your listeners.